Kevin Durant just took an unexpected shot at Klay Thompson, and Klay didn't let it slide. He fired back almost immediately. Draymond Green jumped in soon after, and what started as a debate over the Warriors and 76ers quickly turned into something much more personal. Let me break it down. It started with a question nobody really needed answered. Are the 2026-27 Philadelphia 76ers more talented, on paper, than the Golden State Warriors team that won back-to-back titles in 2017 and 2018? Kevin Durant had an opinion, and he wasn't shy about sharing it. Speaking at a Team USA camp, Durant argued that the newly assembled Sixers roster, boasting 4 elite scoring threats in LeBron James, Jaylen Brown, Joel Embiid, and Tyrese Maxey, had more firepower than his former Golden State squad, which featured only 3 20-point scorers in himself, Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. He put it plainly, pointing out that the last time a team put 3 20-point scorers together, people called it unfair. That was his Warriors team. But now the 76ers have 4 25-point scorers, so he figures they're going to be a contender. That comment alone might have blown over. Sports fans debate hypothetical rosters every day, but Durant didn't stop there. He kept going, and when a fan pushed back on him in the comments, he doubled down, in a way that dragged his old teammates into it by name. Durant wrote that it wasn't close. He listed off the Sixers' resume: Embiid's MVP, Jaylen Brown's Finals MVP, Maxey's All-Star nods, and what Bron does, meaning LeBron. Then he turned to his old Golden State roster and got specific. He said Klay Thompson, never a MVP candidate in anything, 22 PPG, before adding that Draymond, 14 PPG, 7 rebounds and 6 assists. Steph an MVP just like Joel was. He capped it off asking how anyone could think the Warriors team was better on paper. That's the line that changed everything, not the roster debate. The part where Durant reduced Klay Thompson, a 4-time champion, 5-time All-Star, one of the greatest shooters the league has ever produced, down to a scoring average and a dig about never sniffing MVP consideration. Thompson saw it, and he didn't let it slide. He went to his Instagram story and tagged Durant directly. "Man, you good. What are you using my full government name for?" he wrote. It's a short message, but it lands. Klay wasn't debating basketball anymore. He was calling out the tone, the sense that Durant had gone out of his way to use his real name, not a nickname, not bro, but his full government name, like he was building a case against him in an argument that didn't need to be personal. Within hours, this wasn't just a 2-man exchange anymore. Draymond Green, the third piece of that old Golden State core, jumped into the conversation on Threads. He asked if Slim thought he was on his burner, referring to Durant by his nickname, the Slim Reaper. Green's message carried its own edge, the kind of jab that suggests Durant was talking recklessly, like he'd forgotten who might see the receipts. So now you've got 3 men who once stood on a podium together, championship trophies in hand, suddenly split into 2 sides of an online argument that started over a hypothetical roster comparison and somehow turned into a referendum on legacy, respect, and who gets to say what about who. The reaction outside the group was immediate too. NBA analysts didn't wait long to weigh in. ESPN's Stephen A. Smith, among other analysts, ripped Durant for comparing the Sixers to the Warriors, given the ages and injury histories of the stars involved. That's a notable detail. This wasn't just a case of loyal Warriors fans defending their guy. Respected NBA voices looked at Durant's comparison and found it hard to defend on its basketball merits alone, before you even get to the personal shots at Thompson and Green. And LeBron James, the player whose name Durant used to make his larger point about double standards. LeBron James has yet to respond to Durant's comments. Silence from one of the most online superstars in the league. Whether that's strategic or simply LeBron staying out of a fight that isn't his, it left a gap in the conversation that fans and media were quick to fill with speculation. What's clear is this: Klay Thompson didn't come at Durant with a long paragraph or a call-out post. He kept it short, almost dismissive, the kind of response you give somebody who said something so out of pocket you don't even feel like dignifying it with a real argument. But short doesn't mean it didn't land. The internet picked it apart within minutes, dissecting every word, every emoji, every possible subtext. This is where things stood within a single news cycle. A roster debate had become a war of egos between 3 championship-winning teammates, with outside voices from ESPN weighing in, and one of the central figures in the whole debate, LeBron himself, staying completely silent. But to understand why Klay's response cut as deep as it did, and why Draymond felt the need to jump in too, you have to go back further, because this wasn't really about the 2026 Sixers or the 2017 Warriors. This was about a friendship, a dynasty, and a departure that some fans and insiders have spent years suggesting left more scar tissue than anyone in that locker room ever wanted to admit. To understand how we got from a hypothetical roster debate to Draymond Green calling out Kevin Durant by nickname on Threads, you need to rewind to exactly what Durant was reacting to in the first place, and why the Sixers, of all teams, became the flashpoint. Philadelphia went into this NBA offseason and completely rebuilt their identity. The roster now includes Tyrese Maxey, VJ Edgecombe, Jaylen Brown, LeBron James, and Joel Embiid. A collection of names that reads more like an all-star ballot than a normal starting five. It's the kind of roster construction that generates instant debate across NBA media, the sort of what-if conversation sports fans love to have during a quiet off-season. Durant, never one to sit out a basketball debate, jumped in. And when he did, he didn't just say the Sixers were good. He specifically framed it as a comparison to his own history, to the very roster that won him his 2 championships. He argued the Sixers' 4 scorers gave them more on-paper firepower than the Warriors team he helped build. Here's the thing about that comparison. It wasn't really about the Sixers at all. It was about Durant defending a decision he made a decade ago that still follows him everywhere. Durant joining the 2016 Warriors, a team that had just won 73 games and lost the finals in historic fashion, is still one of the most debated player decisions in modern NBA history. Critics have hammered him for years for joining a 73-win team, for taking what some saw as the easy road to a ring instead of building his own. Durant clearly hasn't let that criticism go, because when the fan pushback started rolling in on his Sixers comparison, he pivoted straight into defending that old decision. He argued that fans used a double standard, criticizing him for joining a stacked team, while giving LeBron James a pass, writing that most people are Bron fanatics who get triggered whenever he speaks on basketball, because they believe he stole 2 chips from LeBron, and that people respond emotionally, instead of paying attention to what he actually says. That's a loaded statement. Durant wasn't just comparing rosters anymore. He was relitigating a decade of criticism about his legacy, his ring count, and how it stacks up against LeBron's, and in doing that, he pulled his old Golden State teammates into the blast radius, almost as evidence in his own defense. His argument essentially was that if the current Sixers roster with 4 stars isn't universally seen as an unfair super team, then his old Warriors squad, which only had 3 high scorers, shouldn't have been viewed as such an obvious cheat code either. But to make that argument, he had to diminish what Klay Thompson and Draymond Green actually did on those teams. And that's exactly what he did, breaking down Thompson to a scoring average and a lack of MVP votes, and reducing Green to a stat line that ignored everything he brought defensively and as a locker room presence. This is where the basketball world split into camps almost immediately. On one side, you had people who agreed with Durant's core point, that a 4-star roster is objectively more loaded on paper than a 3-star one, regardless of what any of those players went on to accomplish together. On the other side, you had people who felt Durant was rewriting history to make himself look better, at the direct expense of 2 men who stood next to him on a championship stage twice. Stephen A. Smith wasn't alone among analysts questioning Durant's framing, and the pushback wasn't just about loyalty to old Golden State teammates. It touched on something more fundamental in how NBA greatness gets measured. Embiid has an MVP award, sure, but he's also dealt with chronic injuries that have limited him for years. Jaylen Brown has a Finals MVP, but he won it as the second option behind Jason Tatum, not as a clear-cut alpha. Maxey is an emerging star, but he's never had to be the guy on a championship-level team, the way Klay Thompson was during Golden State's 73-win run and back-to-back title seasons. That's the counter-argument Klay's supporters made almost instantly. His scoring average alone, that 22 points per game Durant threw out, doesn't capture what he actually was to those Warriors teams. He was one of the greatest shooters to ever play, a guy who could go supernova in a single quarter and completely swing a series. His most famous playoff performances aren't remembered for volume scoring. They're remembered for turning entire games on their head with barrages of threes that no other player in league history could replicate. And that's really the crux of why Klay's clapback resonated the way it did. It wasn't a long rebuttal breaking down advanced stats or playoff performances. It was 4 words and a question, "Are you good?" that basically said everything that needed to be said. Klay wasn't going to dignify a debate about his career with a debate. He was going to point out that something about the way Durant brought his name up, using his actual government name like he was cross-examining him, felt off. Draymond's response carried a similar energy, but with sharper teeth, calling out Durant's nickname, asking if Slim thought he was on his burner. Was Draymond's way of suggesting Durant had let his guard down, forgetting that words said in the heat of an Instagram comment section don't just disappear. It's the kind of comment that plays as light trolling on the surface, but carries real weight underneath, especially given the history between these three men. Because here's what makes this whole exchange different from a normal internet spat between former teammates. Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, and Kevin Durant aren't just three guys who happened to play on the same team once. They won 2 championships together. They shared locker rooms during some of the most dominant stretches of basketball anyone has ever seen. They were teammates during a run so good, it changed how front offices around the league thought about roster construction for the better part of a decade, which is exactly why this debate hit differently than your average NBA Twitter argument. When Durant compared his old team unfavorably to the current Sixers, he wasn't just making an abstract basketball point. He was, whether he meant to or not, telling 2 of his former co-champions that they were the weak links in one of the most successful runs in league history. And given everything that happened after Durant left Golden State, the way his departure was covered, the way the narrative around that Warriors breakup has followed all 3 men for years, there was already tinder sitting there, waiting for a spark. To fully grasp why this exchange escalated the way it did, you need to understand what these 3 men actually built together and what it cost each of them when it fell apart. Kevin Durant joined the Warriors in the summer of 2016, arriving at a team that had just set the all-time wins record, and then blown a 3-1 finals lead to Cleveland. It was an unprecedented move, a top 3 player in the league, joining a team that had already proven it could compete for a championship without him. The backlash was instant, and it's never fully gone away. Critics called it the softest move in league history. Fans booed him in road arenas across the country for years. Even now, a decade later, it's clearly still something Durant feels compelled to defend, as shown by his Instagram comments about people believing he stole championships from LeBron. But inside that Golden State locker room, something different was happening. Durant, Curry, Thompson, and Green became one of the most dominant cores basketball has ever seen. They won the title in Durant's first season, going 16-1 through the playoffs, one of the most lopsided postseason runs in NBA history. That 2017 team followed a historic 16-1 playoff run and a 67-15 regular season record fresh, off adding Durant to their star core. They repeated the following year, beating LeBron's Cavaliers again. For 2 seasons, Klay Thompson wasn't the guy people criticized for his scoring average. He was 1/4 of arguably the scariest starting lineup basketball had ever produced. He filled a role that required him to sometimes take a back seat in shot volume so that the offense could flow through Curry and Durant, and he did it without much public complaint. That willingness to sacrifice individual numbers for team success is exactly what Durant's recent comments seem to overlook. The fact that Thompson's modest scoring average wasn't a reflection of his ceiling, it was a reflection of the role he chose to embrace for the good of the team. Then came the unraveling. The 2019 finals against Toronto marked the beginning of the end. Klay Thompson tore his ACL in Game 6, an injury that would keep him out for what became nearly 2.5 years combined, with a later Achilles tear. When Klay Thompson tore his ACL during the 2019 NBA Finals, and the Warriors lost Kevin Durant to the Brooklyn Nets in free agency, it became evident that the team was entering a minor rebuild. That's 2 catastrophic events happening within the same series: Thompson's injury and Durant's decision to leave for Brooklyn as a free agent that summer, a decision made even more dramatic by the fact that Durant himself suffered a torn Achilles during that same finals run before he ever officially departed. It was by any measure one of the most devastating single stretches any championship core has gone through in modern NBA history. For years afterwards, speculation swirled about how the Warriors' locker room actually felt about Durant's departure. Was there resentment? Did Curry, Thompson, and Green feel abandoned after Durant chose to leave rather than try to run it back? Thompson himself has addressed this directly in the past, and notably his answer wasn't bitter. Speaking on a podcast, Thompson said he didn't blame Durant for leaving at all, pointing out that Durant was from the East Coast, and reasoning that after being 2 games away from a three-peat, people were essentially asking what more they wanted from him, a 6-peat. Thompson added that if it wasn't for a series of unfortunate events, they probably would have won 3 championships in that stretch, but that nobody on the team blamed Durant. That's important context. Thompson, by his own account, never carried public resentment toward Durant for leaving. He framed it as understandable. A player from the East Coast wanting to go home. A player who'd already given the Warriors everything he had for 2 title runs. This wasn't a bitter ex-teammate nursing a grudge. This was, by all appearances, a genuine friendship built on mutual respect for what they accomplished together, which makes Durant's recent comments sting even more. If Thompson never held a grudge about the departure itself, being reduced to a scoring average and a jab about MVP votes years later, in the middle of an unrelated debate about a completely different team, reads less like old wounds reopening and more like an unprovoked shot at somebody who'd always defended him. Draymond Green's relationship with Durant has followed a different, rockier path. Their partnership on the court was never quite as smooth as the public narrative around Big Three cores might suggest. There were on-court flare-ups during their time together, including a well-documented confrontation during a game against the Clippers. In Durant's final season with the team, an incident that reportedly created real tension between the two stars. Tension that some believe factored into Durant ultimately deciding to leave for Brooklyn. Green has always had a more combative public relationship with the idea of Durant's Warriors tenure than Thompson has. Quicker to defend the team's identity, quicker to push back if he feels Durant is rewriting how things actually went down. So when Durant took a shot at Green's stat line too, calling him a modest role player numerically, without acknowledging the defensive game-changing playmaking and leadership that made him a genuine defensive player of the year and multiple-time All-Star. It wasn't surprising that Green's response carried more bite than Thompson's. Where Thompson asked if Durant was okay, Green went after the nickname, essentially suggesting Durant had let his guard down and said something he might regret. There's also the current-day context that makes all of this land differently than it might have 5 years ago. Durant is no longer a Warrior, or a Nets player, or a Suns player. He's since moved to the Houston Rockets, continuing what's become a well-traveled veteran career. He's never shy about sharing his opinion, having developed a reputation for being outspoken and argumentative on social media, often with hilarious results, but sometimes getting himself in trouble with his takes. Klay Thompson, meanwhile, has also moved on from Golden State. After parting ways with the only franchise he'd ever known, he's now playing for the Dallas Mavericks, a chapter of his career that represents its own kind of new beginning, separate from the shadow of the Warriors dynasty. Former teammates turned foes on social media, with Dallas Mavericks guard Klay Thompson questioning Kevin Durant. That detail matters. Both men are now on new teams, further removed from the shared identity that once made them nearly inseparable in the public imagination. In some ways, that distance may have made it easier for Durant to speak about the old Warriors core, almost like a historical case study, rather than living, breathing relationships he still has to navigate. But it also means that any shot he takes at Thompson or Green now lands as a shot at people no longer standing beside him in a locker room. A much easier thing to say from Houston than it would have been sitting next to Klay in the Golden State locker room 5 years ago. Once Klay Thompson and Draymond Green fired back, the story stopped being a basketball debate and became a full-blown media event. And in true modern NBA fashion, that meant everyone with a platform had to weigh in. The framing that spread fastest across social media and sports blogs centered on one central image. 3 former champions, once inseparable, suddenly split into opposing camps over a roster debate that, on its face, shouldn't have mattered this much. Headlines described it as former teammates turned foes, a phrase that captures just how quickly the tone shifted from nostalgic debate to something with real edge. Kevin Durant was clearly loving what Philadelphia had going on, but his comments became the internet equivalent of taking a stick to a hornet's nest. After he weighed in on the debate surrounding the Sixers' newly formed roster, it spilled over, and after fans and media analysts jumped to refute him, the online squabble between former Warriors teammates became impossible to ignore. That description, a stick to a hornet's nest, captures something real about how these online sports arguments work in 2026. Durant didn't set out that day to start a fight with 2 of his old teammates. He was making a point about roster construction, defending a decade-old decision that still follows him. But because he chose to use Thompson and Green's specific numbers to make that point, he handed critics exactly the ammunition they needed to turn the conversation personal. While Durant reduced Thompson to 22 PPG and noted he was never a MVP candidate, many viewed that as overlooking the role Klay willingly embraced on Golden State's dynasty. That's the framing that stuck across most coverage of the exchange. Not that Durant was wrong about the raw numbers, but that he was ignoring the context behind them. Numbers without context are easy to weaponize, and that's exactly the criticism that piled up in the comments underneath his own posts. Analysts picked apart the actual basketball logic too, not just the personal angle. Durant and the Warriors got the job done multiple times, something LeBron James and the Sixers can't say, at least not yet. That's a point that undercuts Durant's entire premise. You can have 4 scorers with impressive individual resumes, but championship basketball has never purely been about stacking talent on paper. It's about chemistry, health, timing, and whether that talent can actually get through 4 rounds of playoff basketball together. The Warriors did that twice with Durant on the roster. The Sixers, as constructed, haven't played a single game together yet. That's part of why some analysts speculated Durant's comments weren't really meant to be taken as a serious, airtight basketball argument. Perhaps Durant was just trying to see fans have at it online amid the silence of the NBA offseason. The NBA offseason, especially in early August, is a notoriously quiet stretch for content. No games, no real news, just speculation and hypotheticals. A hot take about historic rosters is exactly the kind of thing that fills that void, whether or not the person making it fully believes every word. But intentional or not, Durant surely got the attention of Thompson, and that attention didn't fade quickly. Fan accounts dissected every word of the exchange. Compilation posts stacked Durant's comments next to Thompson's response, and Green's follow-up format that spreads fast because it lets people relive the entire back and forth in a single scroll. Some fans sided firmly with Durant, arguing that raw statistical comparison is fair game, and that Thompson and Green were being overly sensitive about numbers that are, after all, just numbers. Others argued Durant crossed a line by using former teammates as leverage in an argument that was really about his own legacy and his own frustration with how the joining a 73-win team narrative has followed him for a decade. There's also a layer to this that's easy to miss if you're not tracking Durant's history on social media closely. This isn't the first time he's found himself at the center of an online spat that reveals more about his relationship with public criticism than it does about basketball. Durant has a long, well-documented history of engaging directly with fans and critics on social media, sometimes even getting caught using secondary accounts to argue with people anonymously in years past. He's developed a reputation for being outspoken and argumentative on social media, often with hilarious results. That history primes fans to interpret moments like this one as part of a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Durant getting drawn into an argument he didn't necessarily need to have, and doubling down instead of stepping back once things got personal. That pattern is exactly what makes this specific flashpoint different from the typical good-natured ribbing that often happens between former teammates online. When ex-players jab at each other playfully, there's usually a clear wink underneath it, an unspoken understanding that nothing said is meant to actually damage the relationship. What made this exchange different was the specificity of the shots. Calling out Thompson's exact scoring average, specifically noting he was never in MVP conversations, brought up Green's exact per-game numbers. That's not a broad, jokey jab. That's someone building a detailed case, the kind of thing that reads less like friendly ribbing and more like someone airing a real grievance, while pretending it's just basketball analysis. That's precisely why KD, referring to 2 out of 3 teammates, Draymond and Steph, with more familiarity than Klay Thompson stood out, and why there was real offense to be taken in the never a MVP candidate in nothing comment. Even if it's impossible to know exactly how much of it was playful and how much was genuinely pointed, that ambiguity is exactly what fueled endless debate across sports talk shows and podcasts in the days that followed. Was this real tension boiling over years after the fact? Or was this just 3 competitive alpha personalities doing what they've always done? Trash-talking, needling each other, testing where the lines are? The truth is probably somewhere in between, and that uncertainty is exactly why the story had the legs it did. Nobody could definitively say whether this was a real rupture in a decade-long friendship or just 3 highly competitive men blowing off steam during a slow part of the calendar. What nobody could dispute, though, was the optics. 3 players who once stood on a championship podium together, who built one of the most feared cores in NBA history, were now publicly sparring over whose career mattered more, whose numbers held up, whose sacrifice actually counted for something. That's a hard image to shake, regardless of how much of it was said with a smile behind the screen. So where does all of this actually leave the relationship between Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant, and Draymond Green? All in all, you'd imagine the three will work through any beef, but Durant definitely threw some unnecessary shade at Thompson and Green. And it's clear that neither was too happy about it. That's probably the most level-headed read on the entire situation. These aren't strangers who found a reason to hate each other over a debate about hypothetical rosters. These are men who won 2 championships side by side, who've spoken warmly about each other in interviews for years, and who almost certainly still have real affection for what they built together, even after everything that's happened since. But that doesn't mean the exchange was nothing. Words like Durant's, specifically pulling out Thompson's scoring average and his lack of MVP votes, specifically dismissing Green's stat line, carry weight precisely because they came from someone who knows exactly what those 2 men actually brought to those championship teams. Durant isn't a stranger making an uninformed take from the outside. He was there. He saw firsthand what Thompson's shooting did to opposing defenses, what Green's defense and playmaking meant to the flow of the offense. That's what made the comments cut. And that's likely part of why Thompson and Green responded the way they did, instead of just letting it roll off their backs like they might have with a random pundit's hot take. There's also a broader thread running through this whole saga that goes beyond just one Instagram exchange. Thompson is not ruling out the possibility of running it back with the Warriors before calling it a career. That detail adds an entirely different dimension to how you read this whole situation. Thompson, now with the Mavericks, still hasn't closed the door on a return to Golden State at some point before he retires. If that's true, it means the story of these 3 men and their shared basketball history isn't finished being written. There's still room for another chapter, potentially one where old wounds, whether they're about a departure to Brooklyn or a comment about a scoring average, get folded into something that looks more like reconciliation than rivalry. It's also worth sitting with what didn't happen here. Durant didn't apologize. Thompson didn't escalate beyond his initial pointed but restrained response. Green's jab, sharp as it was, didn't turn into a sustained back and forth. Nobody involved seemed interested in dragging this out into a weeks-long social media war. It flared. It dominated a news cycle. Analysts and fans dissected every angle of it, and then, largely, it settled. That's often how these things go among people who actually know each other. The public sees the spark, but the people involved usually have a much better sense of where the real line is than outside observers give them credit for. Still, there's something worth sitting with in how this all played out. A hypothetical comparison between 2 rosters, one that's played 0 games together, another that won back-to-back championships and one of the most dominant playoff runs in league history, turned into a referendum on how much respect certain players get for the roles they played. Thompson's willingness to take a smaller shot diet so Curry and Durant could operate at their peak efficiency doesn't show up cleanly in a box score. Neither does Green's defensive game planning, his ability to guard multiple positions, or his role as an emotional engine for one of the most successful runs basketball has ever seen. Durant's comments, whether meant seriously or as off-season filler, exposed how easily that kind of contribution gets flattened into a single line of stats when someone's trying to make a different point entirely. And Stephen A. Smith's criticism of the underlying comparison itself deserves a second look here too, because it wasn't really about defending Thompson or Green specifically. It was about the ages and injury histories of the stars involved on this new Sixers roster. Embiid's body has broken down repeatedly over the years. James is playing deep into a career that's already lasted longer than almost anyone in league history. Comparing a roster that hasn't stepped on the court together yet to one that actually delivered back-to-back titles is, on its most basic level, comparing potential to proven results. That's the argument that got lost a bit once the story shifted from basketball analysis to personal jabs between old teammates. As for LeBron, his continued silence on the entire situation is its own quiet statement. He was the name Durant used to make his larger point about double standards. The player Durant felt got a pass for team-building decisions that Durant himself got roasted for. And yet, through all of it, LeBron hasn't weighed in publicly. Whether that's a conscious choice to stay above a fight that isn't really his, or simply a matter of him not feeling the need to respond to comments that were more about Durant's own legacy than about him, it leaves one more loose thread in a story that's collected quite a few of them. What's clear, watching all of this unfold, is that the friendship, or at minimum, the mutual respect, between these 3 men hasn't been erased by one heated exchange. Thompson's past comments about not blaming Durant for leaving Golden State speak to a bond that ran deeper than basketball talk show narratives. But it's also clear that bond isn't immune to friction. reducing a Hall of Fame caliber shooter's career to a scoring average, reducing a Defensive Player of the Year's impact to 3 counting stats. That's the kind of thing that, even among old friends, doesn't just get brushed off without at least a little bit of a response. For now, that's exactly what happened. A short question from Klay, a pointed jab from Draymond, silence from LeBron, and an outspoken star in Houston who once again found himself at the center of a debate he started, defending a decision from a decade ago that clearly still means something to him. Whether this fades into just another footnote in the long, complicated story of the Golden State dynasty, or whether it resurfaces the next time these 3 men cross paths, is something only time will answer. But for 1 week in early August, 3 champions who once stood shoulder to shoulder on a podium found themselves standing on opposite sides of a debate that was never really about basketball at all.